Oh, here we are. I think we're on. Okay, so here we are for the midterm, and this is what we're going to do tonight. Let's take a look at what we've been doing, what'll be on the exam, all that sort of stuff. And so the best thing to do is get started, and let's find out what we're going to do. Well, as I mentioned way back when during our orientation session, your midterm exam is available to you for 1 week. And it begins this Thursday, April 28th, and it will end on May 5th. So whenever you find the time during that 1 week period, you can get into the testing lab and take your exam. It is in the Instructional Testing Services Lab, the service, whatever they call themselves now. It's over in the center building. It is number 311. Nice deluxe accommodations, and so that's where you will take the exam. Of course, if you're not in the area, if you're part of Cottage Grove or Florence, you take it in your appropriate office in Cottage Grove or Florence. So you know how that works. It is an objective exam, and it is a computer exam, so in that regard, you don't have to write anything. It's not, there are no short answer, there's nothing like that. It's all done in the computer, and there will be 50 questions. The good news is that you are allowed one 3x5 note card. So, as I mentioned way back when, the thing to do is to go through your notes, go over the material, and the stuff that you know, don't bother with because it'll come to you. But the stuff that you might, have a little problem with, you can put that on your note card and take it with you. And yes, you can use front and back. There is a study guide that's now available on Moodle. You can download that, and it will contain a little more information than what I'm giving you tonight, and depending on how much I talk about the stuff. But it does give you something that you'll have in front of you so that you go through that study guide and review the material in there. And if you have a good understanding of what's going on with that material, you've got it made. Okay, so I also want to remind you that you are responsible for the exam, and what that means is you are responsible for getting to the exam. So check their office hours through their website, as you see there. It's also on the syllabus, and I believe there's a link on Moodle, I'm not sure. But anyway, you can get to the testing lab there and check the information, and the information is essentially their hours of operation. And I want to emphasize that you're at their mercy, more or less. So if you want to take it on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, it's not going to happen because they're not open. But if you say, well, I want to come back at night and take it, you can check and find out, how late are they open? And if they're open until 9 o'clock, it doesn't mean that you get there at 5 minutes to 9 o'clock. So that's what I mean about you are responsible for your own exam. There'll be no makeup exams, so get in there and take it. Again, you have 1 week to do it. And now let's take a look at what will be on the exam. So it's essentially what it's covering is our first week through this week. It's the classic Hollywood style through the romantic comedy. And we begin this way. You should have a good understanding of the American movie industry and recognize that it involves three things: the production of films, the distribution of those films to theaters, and the exhibition of those films in the theaters. So that's the first thing. As an industry, it is production, distribution, exhibition. Secondly, the industry's use of genre to minimize financial risk. And I'll talk about that later. So let's look at the first part. Okay. You also need to understand the history of the motion picture, that it really begins simply with experimentation. It begins with a projection technology. have an understanding of how that worked with regard to persistence of vision, which is a notion that they have. It's supposedly, if you take a series of still frames in sequence and run them by you, what you get is motion. So that's what the persistence of vision is. With silent film, it was more or less somewhere between, nobody knows for sure, but somewhere between 12 and 18 frames per second. So if you had 18 of those frames running through that projector, 18 frames per second, you got movement. So what you see on the screen with all that movement is a natural kind of movement. When sound came along, that changed to a standard 24 frames per second. The reason for that is not so much that it improved motion, but it was the best fidelity they could get. So when that film strip is running through the projector at 24 frames per second, it is reproducing sound at a realistic speed. So that's essentially why it's 24 frames per second. Also understand the key innovations and the individuals involved here at this early technology. Understand what the kinetoscope is. Obviously, it is Edison that we credit with the invention of the motion picture. Actually, he wasn't even designing, wasn't even looking for a movie. He was looking for something with pictures to accompany his phonograph, and then he started working on movies that way. And the contribution of Dixon, recognized the Nickelodeon era, when this is when we first start getting theaters, first start getting places where they will show movies. The MPPC, which existed roughly 1908 to 1915, which is the Motion Picture Patents Company. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then what finally emerged in exhibition, the movie palace. Huge, great big buildings where you watch movies, where you put your money down to watch a movie. And these movie palaces, they reflected what you were seeing in the movies. That is, they were opulent. Okay, the classic narrative style, the ways in which cinematic stories are told. There's a lot here, there's a lot in the video series, and there's a lot in our book that talk about this narrative style. So let's take a look at the highlights and talk about these things in particular. The first thing is, when we talk about this narrative style, is what's called equilibrium and disruption. What that means is this, taken right out of our book. An initial state of affairs is introduced after which something occurs to disturb this equilibrium. In other words, what you have is, in 99.9% of all films, of all narratives in film, what happens is it opens, the movie begins with equilibrium. It begins with the idea that everything is normal, everything is standard, everything is in everything is working for this equilibrium. That is, everything is fine. There's no problem. But subsequent to that, when we recognize that we have equilibrium, something comes along to disturb that. Something upsets the equilibrium, and it can be any number of things. In a typical film, Hollywood film melodrama, it's a villain of some sort. Some evil, rotten, no good person enters the scene and disrupts that equilibrium, okay? Subsequent events attempt to restore the original status quo, but this is repeatedly frustrated and order is recovered only at the end of the film. So again, you can say this if you are a movie nut, if you watch movies a lot, if you watch television a lot, if you like narratives like that, you can do this in your sleep. You know that what happens is, once that equilibrium is upset, somebody has to, what? Restore the original status quo. But in so doing, what creates for the drama is that it is frustrated repeatedly. It is like one step forward, maybe two steps backward. But knowing Hollywood film, we know that order will be restored at the end of the film. That was one of the things about Star Wars, why everybody was crazy about Star Wars in 1977, was it followed that essential narrative pattern to a T. It was a throwback to the old Hollywood traditions of filmmaking. Okay, problem solving is number 2. Problem solving, again, according to our book. Over the course of the narrative, characters struggle to achieve their goals or solve their problems. That's a given as well. We have the hero who is trying to return equilibrium, and what happens is he struggles with all sorts of problems to solve the problem, and that is restoring equilibrium. And it can be anything. It can be outside influences. He struggles against the elements. He struggles against the weather. He struggles against society. He struggles against all kinds of outside things. And it could be at the same time he struggles against himself. He is a weak person, or he perceives himself as weak. That sort of thing when you have these what we call character studies. Number 2, they overcome those who stand in their way. They triumph over adverse circumstances and or transcend their own limitations. So this person is able to solve a problem and overcome the outside forces. He triumphs over all of those adverse circumstances. And he may also, in so doing, he transcends his own limitations. He discovers that I wasn't weak after all. That when push comes to shove, I can have the resolve, I do have the initiative to succeed. They also talk about temporal and spatial limits. That's pretty simple because it's exactly what it means. Temporal dimension is a specific deadline. It has to be met, or a certain task has to be completed by a definite time. What that means is simply it's a time issue. We have to, I'm thinking of, the one that always comes to mind is that film that was made in the late 40s called DOA, in which the protagonist has been poisoned, and he's going to die. There's no question about it. He's going to die. But he has a certain amount of time before he dies, and so he spends that time trying to find his killer. An interesting movie. Then there is also the spatial dimension, characters moving toward precise destinations or geographical goals. The simple one for that, as you can see, an obvious one is a Western wagon train story where they leave St. Louis and they have to reach Oregon, along the Oregon Trail. So as they move toward that destination, they run into all kinds of struggles. Okay, and then there is journey. Journey is the mythic, in the mythic sense. Our book puts it this way: inside the narrative, that is, when you're looking at the movie, what you find are characters move not only spatially, but they realize other non-spatial goals as well, such as making deadlines, solving mysteries, falling in love, discovering new worlds, and coming to terms with themselves and or their fellow travelers. So in this regard, your journey is sort of this allegorical one in which you're on a journey to improve yourself. You're on a journey to discover yourself, as well as on these other things, such as solving a mystery. The journey takes you from Baker Street, 221B Baker Street, to Dartmoor to solve the murder of Sir Charles Baskerville, that sort of thing. Also, the book discusses what they call the audience's journey. Now, what that means is going to the movies. What we see on the screen is what we are doing at that very moment. We are looking for goals, participating in deadlines, and undertaking journeys. This is the allegory it's within ourselves. This is why we go to the movie. What is always nice about that, unlike television, which comes to us, which preys upon us, in the movies, you make the effort to go. And when you get there, you participate in those journeys. It's had a professor at one time that said going to the movies is almost like going to church. You are participating in a ritual. When you're there, the ritual is, yes, I give myself to the screen, and I'm worshiping that screen, and it's showing me all kinds of wonderful things about myself. Okay, and then the last thing is they make this point about segmentation. Now, what that means is, actually, you know, the starting off point here is with Aristotle. Aristotle created for us, for all these thousands of years, what he called the dramatic unities, which were action, time, and space. Most films violate the traditional unities and lend themselves to segmentation. So what that means is it's this process, number one up there, that breaks the film down into its basic narrative units. We can do that. We can stop and look at each kind of sequence, and within the sequence is a scene, these kinds of things, and we can break that down and we can look at them individually and as well as look at them in the grand scheme of things. Even the people who are involved in film production recognize segmentation, because when you are producing films, you are producing them in a segmented way. You know, scene one, take one, kind of a thing. That's the segmentation. And then you put it all together through very classic and very creative editing to create a whole for us. So in many respects, a film is like a gestalt. What that means, you know, the sense that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. All right, that was enough of that stuff. Then we look at film techniques and relationships to the narrative. There's a series of things that you should have a good understanding of, such as what mise en scène is. Mise en scène is a French word, a French term that means putting on the scene. What that is everything that you see within the frame. That's part of the analysis of any film. The things that you see within that frame. As you see, up there, it goes like this, and then it comes down, and it, you know, the only thing you're concerned with is what's within that frame. There are some filmmakers who use a cluttered mise en scène. Some filmmakers, I remember back in the 60s, there was a filmmaker, a British filmmaker named Sidney Furie, and he had this habit of shooting through things all the time. Even Michael Caine, one of the first movies he got noticed for was in a film called The Ipcress File, which was a James Bond type film, and Michael Caine wore glasses. And seemed like Fury was always shooting through his glasses. Michael Caine would take his glasses off, put it on a stand, the camera would cut down there, and we'd see things through his glasses. There's camera movement, the techniques. What kind of movement do we have? Every kind of movement. You know, if the camera sits on its pedestal, on its tripod, whatever it sits on, and if it moves laterally like this, we have panning. And if it moves up and down, you know, and it can also move on that pedestal, and it can move sideways on that pedestal, and it can move on the z-axis. It can move in and move away, and it can also sit on that pedestal, and it can rise like a crane, and that's what they call a crane shot. And it has all of these kinds of things. So we understand camera movement, lighting, the different types and the effects. They make a big deal about lighting is basically the three-point lighting. Okay, so keep that in mind. Three-point lighting, that's the basic. Sound, all the stuff involved with that. The mics and mixing, scoring, continuity. You have the recording of live sound, and then you have all of the stuff that is done in mixing. You know the difference between the shot and the scene. The shot is simply turning the camera on, turning it off. All right, a scene is a dramatic unit. Scene editing, between and within scenes. Okay, in the old days, they didn't know how to do any of this stuff. In the old days, they had to just, okay, we finished with this scene, so we fade out, fade into the next one. Then they discovered they can do the dissolve, what they called in the beginning the lap dissolve. And so we have all of this kind of stuff. Scene organization, linear, which is basically what it is all about. It just moves from A to Z, but then it can have circular and flashback and all of that. Cross-cutting, which is cutting among things that are happening at the same time. Point of view editing, and the 180-degree rule, which is to maintain continuity. They call it don't cross the line. We got to move on to the studio system. That's the next thing. And in the beginning, there was the Motion Picture Patents Company. It's not exactly a studio, but it controlled the film industry because it was Edison's company. And if you were going to make a movie, you had to get a license from Edison to do it. And if you didn't, he sent his thugs out to find you. The key players in the creation of the early studio system, and there they are: William Fox, Carl Laemmle at Universal, Louis B. Mayer, Samuel Goldwyn, and Marcus Lowe. They created what we now call the studio system, the movie factories. The strategies of control. This is what our production, distribution, exhibition was all about. It means it's an oligopoly. It means vertical integration. In other words, we control everything. We make the movies, we distribute the movies, and we distribute them to our own theaters. We set all of this up with blind booking and block booking. Those, you know, like blind booking means you have to buy our movie without seeing it. Block booking means that if you want this good picture, you got to buy a whole bunch of our pictures. And this was, of course, sent to independent theaters. And finally, the Sherman antitrust ruling in 1915 destroyed the MPCC. So Edison lost control. The 5 major studios out there in the beginning: Paramount, under the guidance of Zukor, Lowe's Incorporated, and MGM. Lowe's Incorporated owned the theaters, and then MGM was their production side of it. William Fox started Fox Film and merged with 20th Century Pictures, Xanax Company, to form 20th Century Fox. You had all the Warner Brothers, and then you had the RKO Radio. Those were the major studios producing the major films. In there also were the minor ones. They didn't have as much money as these others. It was Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. The low-budget filmmakers, which were known as Poverty Row: Republic Pictures, Monogram, Grand National, PRC, Eagle Lion, and later in the 50s, Allied Artists and American International. Understand the Department of Justice Paramount case in 1958. That did away with the oligopoly. That meant that they had to get rid of something. They had to quit making films or distributing films or exhibiting films, and they decided that they'd get rid of their theaters. The effect of breakup on current film production and the average cost of film production over time, of course, we all know that, is in the millions upon millions. And as it says, essentially the effect of the breakup is that last bullet point, that old studios are now financiers. They distribute independently made films. They bankroll them and then distribute them. Also have an idea about the star. Essentially, the important thing about that is point 1 and point 5, that stars have masks or personas created by film studios in the beginning. That's when you had things like Douglas Fairbanks, who was known for his action, and you had America's Sweetheart, Mary Pickford, that kind of thing. And number 5, that since the breakup of the studio system, the stars can make it via other media. For example, you become a singer, you know right away that this singer is going to end up in a movie. Okay, now genre. This is an important part. This is that second part of our understanding movies at this time. Genre is the ability to categorize movies. When you can call it, that's a Western, that's a war movie, that's a mystery, and so forth. Genre serves to stabilize an otherwise unstable movie industry, and it does it through familiarity. It means that people like to see these things that are made in the Wild West, and so if they like it, we'll keep making Westerns, and people will go to it simply because it is a Western. Each new film banks on a number of familiar elements, motifs, and themes, but always in a new way. Think of it like music. when you have music which is known as theme and variation. You have the same theme, but it varies throughout the entire, 8 movements or whatever of it. And so same thing with the films. You have a Western. Everybody knows what a Western looks like, but each Western has its own uniqueness. So let's look at the Western. It's distinctly American. It's based on dime novels and real-life characters who get fictional treatment. The 3 essential ingredients, the hero and the villain, and the landscape. We made quite a do about the landscape, and when you think of John Ford Westerns, what you think of is Monument Valley. The symbolism, East meets West, fact meets fiction, culture versus nature, and the culture conflicts. Native American culture versus the European culture in America. It's the Eastern culture meets the Wild West, and all those kinds of things that are depicted in Westerns. And then the final Western is the space film, the final frontier. Most space films out there act like Westerns. Moving on to the comedy. The comic is an expression of social repression. The themes of American comedy, as you can see there, the ones that the early comedies were disintegration and disorder. That's what slapstick was used. Then the class and democracy. Have a good working understanding of the comedy actors. In silent comedy, you have slapstick with Chaplin and Keaton primarily. And then in early sound, it becomes verbal wit. With sound, you've got to have more than just physical kind of comedy. Pratfalls, that sort of thing. With comedy comes verbal wit. The ones who succeeded, of course, Laurel and Hardy made the transition from silent into sound. But primarily, the ones that we think of with the verbal wit were the Marx Brothers. And then also there is, as the book tells us, there is one guy that really made a success moving from silent to sound, and that was Harold Lloyd. Okay, the romantic screwball, that's blah, blah, blah. You have a good understanding of that, and it's just an understanding. The comedies that followed the screwball, okay. So we're reaching the end. If you are confused, bewildered, rattled, depressed, and desperate, then stop by during office hours or send me an email if you need specific answers about things. Also to remind you that the study guide is now available on Moodle for downloading. And let's see, there'll be no makeup exam, so get there. You have a week to get it done, remember. And again, you are responsible for your exam. So I emphasize that because I have some students that come crying into my office because they missed the exam, and I want to know, how can you? It was there for a week. So it's up to you to get in there. You have a week to get it done, and that's it, the end. We did it. Any questions from those here? All right, we got it. Sounds good. One question, yeah.
What's our textbook called?
What is it? American Culture, American Film, or American Film, American Culture, something like that. Okay, that was, what's the name of the textbook? Well, the textbook has American Film, American Culture, something like that. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Good luck. See you next time. It's what?